On that very note, thank you all for being here. I am Brian. I'm an assistant professor. I teach modern political philosophy here, and I'm very happy to be a part of the department, and it gives me a great honor and privilege to be sharing the stage with my very esteemed colleagues and also all of you here in the room. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. Firstly, please switch your mobile phones to silent if that's okay, and if not, you can switch it off. So that's a great choice there. Secondly, if you'd like to ask questions, please do raise your hands. We want to bring in as many as possible questions, both online and offline. So for those of you who are currently online, I'll be bringing you in as well. There are 33 of you or 32 of you. So I will indeed be calling upon you, as I usually do my students, to ask questions. So please do that. That's to the online audience. And thirdly, this is an interactive session. So we want to maximize the engagement and also the quality of contributions from the floor as well. And that's why if I'm not being sufficiently inclusive, please just remind me of that fact. And fourthly, yes, we're going to take a quick photo. So let's start with a photo in this direction, and we'll do another photo in the opposite direction as well, if that's okay. And whilst we're doing that, please give a massive round of applause to our admin staff, Erica and Kelly, for the incredible work. And also our home at the back, who's been receiving you. He's been a great supporter and also facilitator as well. Thank you, Alhom. Are you still there? Yes, you are. Great. Wonderful. All righty. Fantastic. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our panelists. First up, we have Chair Professor of Philosophy, Herman Cappelen, who explores a wide range of issues, ranging from conceptual engineering to the meaning of democracy through to AI and governance, and is just about the most prolific academic I know in HKU. So Herman, thank you for being here with us. You're most welcome. Next up, we have Associate Professor Simon Goldstein, who's also in the Department of Philosophy, and he is a fantastic thinker on many issues, as I've come to know in our conversations, ranging from how to tackle very complex geopolitical crises to figuring out why the AI race isn't really an actual race. So we're very privileged to have Simon here with us. And third up, we have Associate Professor Boris Babic, who is who wears many hats, and Boris is fantastic. He's a very seasoned lawyer, an exceptional writer on law, especially in relation to tech law and tech disputes, and is also, a veteran expert in data science and philosophy. We're privileged to have him join us. And last but not least is my dear friend and also a fellow comrade in arms in journalistic writing, to be very clear. Yes, to be very clear, I need to emphasize that. And Wang is the editor-in-chief of Financial Times Chinese and is one of the most well-known journalists in the sinosphere in Greater China. So these are your panelists, and they're most welcome. Please join me in welcoming them with a round of warm applause. Thank you very much. Here's how the next 90 minutes or so will proceed. I'll start by offering a few remarks on the topic at hand, and I'm going to invite each of the panelists to offer their concise opening remarks, following which we'll have one or two rounds of questions, and then finally, or not finally, we'll open up the floor to audience contributions and also your thoughts as well. And again, I'll try my best to call upon folks in a room, so if you'd like to speak, or if you'd not like to speak, I will still call upon you. So that is what I promise. That's my pledge, really, which is a very minimal pledge. On that note, AI and geopolitics. When I see these two words, the three core comments that come to my mind whenever I see these two concepts, hand in hand. And the first is the observation that the victory, or rather the successes of Deepseek and the recent breakthroughs over the past couple of months has often been portrayed to be, this victory of a state. China wins, the US has lost, and then you hear all of these very sort of incredibly, ebullient narratives are being put out, thought pieces, takes about how the US hegemony is dwindling, is on decline, and how China has won. But I would actually posit that it's not really China that's won or that the US has lost. It's instead the victory of open source AI, the victory of a sort of David-oriented approach to developing AI models without leaning into large, often opaque, and lacking in transparency corporations that characterize the default modus operandi of the likes of OpenAI and co, which is to say that rather than framing this as a nation-to-nation rivalry, we should really be seeing Deepseek's victory as one where the people, where the grassroots, where the little Davids on the streets have somehow pull through using much less capital and far fewer resources as compared with a more, well-endowed counterpart, so to speak. Now, this is not to say that we should take the 6 million USD figure at face value. And of course, there are clear caveats even in the original paper in which Deepseek outlines, explains, their upshots and findings. But it is to say that maybe we should cheer on open source AI whilst also reflecting upon the possible calamities and risks that come alongside that, such as, for instance, heightened risk of terrorism, of non-state actors, of big corporations, of illicit actors exploiting AI to serve their own ulterior motives. With the porousness and also openness of the market, the more open it is, the harder it is to regulate. And that is something that actually Simon talked about this morning on an episode of Backchat for RTHK, and I thought he made that point beautifully and very clearly as well. The second quick point is to think about the world beyond China and the US. The world is larger than just China and the US. There's ASEAN, there's the Gulf, there's Israel, there's the European Union, as lethargically bogged down in regulation as they may be. We still love them, especially the Parisians with a lovely, espresso and also baguettes, but jokes aside, there really is a lot of merit in taking seriously the world beyond the Sino-American dyad. And to frame everything and all through the lenses of great power rivalry is very good at selling articles and books, but not particularly useful in helping us understand the stakes involved for the rest of the world, the other 80%, so to speak, of planet Earth. And that ties me on to the final point I want to make today, which is the intersection and the sort of escalatory spiral where geopolitical and AI risks compound one another. I was explaining this in a lecture I gave in Cambodia around 4 months ago, and Boris and I were both in Cambodia speaking to a very, very packed hall of civil servants at the Ministry of Land Management, Urban Planning and Construction. And many were concerned about the risks of AI per se, lack of transparency, lack of regulation or accountability, inexplainability, black box, you name it. But I actually posited that the geopolitical risk would only compound that. Because the more countries are bogged down in zero-sum thinking, instead of securitizing the data and not engaging in a much-needed collaboration and dialogue with one another, the less likely it is that we're going to get the regulation and the compliance in place to ensure that minimum guardrails are in place for, AI model development and training and beyond. So seeing as I'm not the keynote speakers for today, I'm going to stop right there. I assure you. And I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel as well, which I'm very honored to be chairing. So please, once again, a massive round of applause for my fellow panelists. Thank you very much. And now we shall begin with Professor Herman Cappelen. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. I'm going to start with a sort of gloomy picture, not the more rosy picture that you were sketching for us. So Dario Amodei is the CEO of Anthropic. When Deepseek came out, he wrote this piece that I think is pretty disturbing, and it sort of paints a picture of something that makes Deepseek look really, really dangerous, and that it's the source of something that should trigger a really intense battle between the United States and China. So I'll say a little bit just about how Amodei is thinking about it and why I think it's really very bad to think the way that Amodei is thinking. So his thought is, we are not very far away from artificial general intelligence, and maybe not even very far away from artificial super intelligence. And whoever gets those things within 2 or 3 years will have a kind of world supremacy. They will have military power that no other country has. They will have financial advantages that no other country has. So getting that first is incredibly important. If you have it, just focus on the military part initially, you will have super military power, and you will be the leading power in the world for the foreseeable. There'll be kind of supremacy. So if suddenly China is leading or is at the same level as the United States, there's an imperative, if you want the United States to have that kind of supremacy, to repress China. That's the way Amodei is thinking about it. His solution to this is chips, restrictions on chips, because he thinks the United States are really great at making chips, and you need these chips in order to really make progress over the next few years. And so he's suggesting very, very, very severe restrictions on chips. And then the goal of that, he's thinking, is we will get United States supremacy for the foreseeable future, for a very, very long time. I think this is a very bad way to think. So I'll tell you why. I think that thinking about the race in this way is dangerous. And I'll just give 4 quick points about why I think it's a very bad way to think about it. The first thing is I just think people keep saying that the United States has the lead in chips is a very weird way of talking, because all these chips are made right off the coast of China in Taiwan by TSMC. The United States, the people in the United States don't know how to make chips. They try to make a few chips in Arizona. They make about 2% of the world's chips. They couldn't even do it without help from Taiwan. So I don't think it's really true that the United States is leaders in chip production. Second point that I think makes this incredibly dangerous. Suppose you really believe, so this is a sort of provocative point here, but I think if you really think through the Amadei thought seriously, suppose you really think that over the next 2-3 years, through chip restrictions on China, the United States will get world supremacy, militarily and financially. I mean, if you really believe that, then of course China should invade Taiwan and destroy TSMC's capacity for making chips immediately. That would be completely rational. That, you know, if you don't want to be subordinate to the United States for the foreseeable future, that's what you should be doing. Now, I don't think that's the right thing to do, because I actually think the way Amadei sets things up is wrong. I think even if you manage to develop very, very powerful LLMs, the way in which this is integrated into something that gives you financial and military advantages, and this is something the first panel was talking about too, there's a massive step. You need to integrate it into your societal structures, into laws, regulations. You need to, in the military case, put it into actual weapons, into robots, into things that can move into cities, that can actually do things on a battlefield. So that connects to things in robotics and all kinds of mechanical and complicated things that doesn't have anything to do just with the chips you have or the models, you know, the powerfulness of those models. So in short, I think it's very dangerous to see this as the kind of battle that Amadei sets it up as. And if you do, I think the consequences could be very severe. But as I said, I think we should not think about it in that way, because it's much more complicated to get to that point of supremacy. That's going to be my introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Herman. I now invite Simon to continue the discussion. So over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give a model of conflict and then apply it to US-China AI conflict. So the general model of conflict I think we should be using is called costly lotteries, or the bargaining model. Here's the idea. Okay, the US and China are in a conflict, and that means they face a choice, and it's something like this. Say that the US has a 60% chance, 60% strength. China has 40% strength. They're fighting over a pot of resources, 100 units. And what does it mean that the US has 60% strength? That means if they, if they decide to engage in the conflict, they've got a 60% chance of winning the pot, but there's a cost to playing. You're going to destroy some of the resources if you play. This conflict could be a military conflict. It could also be an economic conflict. So when the US engages in trade wars or export controls, that's a deadweight loss, so it destroys some of the pot, but then they have a chance of winning a share of the remaining resources. So that's a general model of conflict that we can apply to AI conflict in particular. And when we apply it that way, there's interesting choices, because the key feature of this model is there's an alternative to engaging in this lottery, the costly lottery, which is striking a bargain. And when you strike a bargain, you choose not to engage in the conflict, and you just split the pot without the cost. So the idea is, even if the US has a 60% chance of winning the full pot, less the cost, say 20 units of resources, what if they just instead agreed to split the pot 50-50 with China without destroying some of the resources? That's actually better for both the US and China in that example. Than it would be for the US to go ahead. Even though they have a better chance of winning, it'll destroy some of the resources. So that's always the choice in a conflict, is do you try to bargain and split the whole pot, or do you do the lottery and then you have a chance of winning the whole thing, but it destroys some of the resources? This model you can then apply to AI and Deepseek and US-China conflict. And what happens is there are specific ways that you can fail to make bargains. And those are the causes of war or the causes of economic conflict, the causes of conflict. So why would two parties not be able to make a bargain? The first reason that is a big issue related to Deepseek is when the two parties don't agree on their chance of victory. If China thinks they have a high chance of victory, and the US thinks China has a low chance of victory, then there's not going to be a bargain that they can strike because there's no bargaining range. 50-50 looks worse. Basically, any bargain that the US would offer, China thinks is worse in expectation. But the issue is, one issue with DeepSeek is that the US and China, I don't think currently agree on whether China has caught up. I'm getting the sense, a lot of Chinese pundits are thinking that China has caught up, whereas Dario Amodei and, OpenAI is claiming, oh, they stole our model. And Dario Amodei said, oh, actually, we're just as good. We're just using it to build the next model. So there's not agreement on the chance of victory. So that's a big issue that raises the chance of conflict. Next big cause of why you can't make a bargain is called issue indivisibility. Okay, if you're just bargaining over money, you make a bargain, you just split the money. But what happens if you're bargaining over land? It's very hard to split the land. When you're thinking about bargaining over AI, it's very unclear what is the resources that you're dividing. The things that, we were talking in the last panel about AI is going to change the world. Well, the thing isn't here yet. So what exactly are you splitting? I think a dream scenario would be maybe the US and China could agree to a 50-50 split of world chips. Of course, the offer the US has currently proposed is a 100-0 split, which is not a very attractive bargain. But anyways, you get the picture. Then the next cause of war would be what's called preemptive war, which is when there's a first strike advantage. When you have offense beats defense, then you don't bargain because actually you're in a prisoner's dilemma. And if you just strike first, you get much more. And so then that would be the issue that AI may disrupt, for example, military conflict and have a huge first strike advantage. That's a big issue because AIs might just disable all your aircraft carriers, for example. And then the last cause Herman already alluded to, that's called preventive war, which is power shifts. So if you expect that your opponent is about to get way more powerful, and next year they'll be way more powerful, even if you make a deal right now, next year your opponent's going to just renegotiate it. So it's like, suppose China tries to settle with the US right now, and they also think, oh no, next year the US is going to invent God, and then they're going to have world control over AI. Well, obviously, in that situation, the US would probably renegotiate the deal. And then that gives an incentive for China to go for the TSMC fabs. So I think that's a useful model for trying to think through what are the causes of conflict and how do we avoid it.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you. And I think a useful supplement that we can think about here is also requires us to unpack the causes of DeepSeek success, but also to try and figure out what it actually means in this sort of AI developmental race, if there is indeed one. Traditionally, there's this fixation upon raw compute, the thought that if you throw a lot of compute at AI development, the more you throw at it, the better. So it's sort of almost like a geometric relationship, or there's a coefficient, you multiply it by that, and that coefficient stays constant. What I think DeepSeek success, if we are indeed to believe in the conclusions to be drawn from its paper, tells us is that algorithmic efficiency and improving the quality of the algorithms and by which they're deployed could also play a key role in advancing AI models independent of substantial increases to raw compute. And that's something we might want to bear in mind, alongside recognizing, of course, that there are also other means by which AI could become more useful and more utile via what some analysts have termed as so-called unhobbling, which is to say the development of qualitatively different functionalities, like, for instance, having a memory or continued ability to store and process memories. That's a hypothetical possibility that has yet to materialize, but it's worth bearing that in mind. In any case, I now turn it over to Boris to continue our introductory remarks. Over to you, Boris.
Thanks, Brian. So I'll just pick up right where Brian left off here, which is the algorithmic efficiency. And since we promised to talk about the technical innovations, I think there's essentially four things. The last isn't algorithmic, but four things that DeepSeek does well. So one is that they use a mixture model instead of relying on the full model for every task. What that means is when you're using the feed-forward neural network, instead of applying the whole network for every task, you use subparts of that network. And from an efficiency perspective, that makes a lot of sense. They also use a less precise floating point representation of basically numbers to binary for training models. What that means is, so FP32 is the usual sort of standard, which is that you use 32 bits to represent a number. They use 8 bits to represent a number, which means that it's less precise, But that's okay in contexts like LLMs where the parameter weights don't require exact precision. You can compare this, for example, to robotics and manufacturing where you actually need to execute a control task precisely. Three, they use reinforcement learning instead of supervised fine tuning, which is cheaper and more flexible. And then four, the non-algorithmic part is that the model is open source, and that reinforces innovation and invites everybody to contribute to the model. What this means, for example, for bigger picture questions like the race toward AGI, I don't actually think it means a lot. I think in general, the notion of AGI is incoherent, and it is people like Amadeo from Anthropic and stuff that are pushing this. What does this mean for the race for AI dominance? I think the race for AI dominance is also largely an artifact of the Silicon Valley tech community and a narrative that they've created to encourage export controls and tariffs on Chinese companies from the perspective of self-interest. So this is what Herman's talked about. How another sort of issue, geopolitical issue that has arisen in these discussions is how does this compare to the space race and as Deepseek America's Sputnik moment? One interesting facet to me is that the space race was driven by large-scale differences in political ideology, whereas the AI race is driven by tech entrepreneurs using pseudo-technical propaganda to fan the flames of an already fraught geopolitical relationship, as Herman talked about in his discussion of Anthropic. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Boris. And last but not least, of course, Feng. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd be lying if I say I don't feel I'm totally outgunned and out of my weight here. This is not my usual crowd. I'm usually in Brian's shoes asking the questions because as a journalist, that's what I have. I have questions instead of answers, not to mention, philosophical framework. So I'm totally out of my weight. What I can share is indeed this DeepSeek phenomenon has been blowing up in the last few weeks, and especially during the Chinese New Year. I got nothing to do, so I started reading what's coming out of the US. In particular, I wanted to share, many of you probably already read this, 2 podcasts that were particularly revealing. You probably know what I'm talking about. Number one, the All In podcast, hosted by Jason Cappelen. And this one, they featured David Sachs, yes, who is what they call the AI and crypto czar of the Trump administration. So the chief advisor to the Trump administration on matters of AI and crypto. A second one, super long one, 5 hours long, the Lex Friedman podcast, the most recent edition of the Lex Friedman podcast, where this one featured one of Silicon Valley's top AI analysts, Dylan Patel, and also a top AI researcher from the Allen Institute. So these 2 podcasts, altogether like 6 hours, 7 hours long, were my main source of reference for this discussion. After hearing Dean Cappelen's analysis on when these Silicon Valley tech bros talk about AI supremacy, talk about the race to AGI, the first thing that comes to their mind is military application. Nothing else. They're not talking about saving the human race, solving climate change, or even helping Elon Musk fly to Mars. Instead, they go zero in directly to military. This says something about the current state of mind in Silicon Valley. One of our common friends, Tianyu,
Yeah,
his research subject is on the military roots of Silicon Valley. I think this topic you're probably going to hear a lot in the coming years. So to a large degree, Silicon Valley, the tech bros of Silicon Valley are now racing back to their military and defense industry roots, as demonstrated by the top minds, the most brightest investors, analysts, and AI scientists on these 2 podcasts. They were all talking about this. And my chief takeaway from those 2 podcasts were they were talking about a specific time frame of 5 years. Amode mentioned something like achieving AGI or super AI in the next year or two. Most of the other guys on the podcast say he's exaggerating a little bit for personal or for private selfish interest. You know, he has a motive to promote. Not that Anthropic seems to have fallen behind a little bit in all of this media frenzy, but most of the other guys were talking about something more or less of a 3 to 5 year time frame, during which they believe the US is very likely, or some of the leading companies are very likely to achieve something close to AGI. And again, they zero in directly on military application. AGI means US military dominance, end of the Cold War, end of everything. US won, China loses. That's their unified mentality. I was shocked. But again, when we think about the so-called remilitarization of Silicon Valley, it doesn't really come as a big surprise. There's also a very interesting anecdote I wanted to share. Some of the Chinese students here during the Chinese New Year probably saw it already on WeChat. One of the most viral videos on Tencent videos or TikTok, everything Chinese video platforms, during the Chinese New Year. Do you remember what it was? It was a drone, a big DJI drone, and a unitary robot dog shooting fireworks, Gatling gun fireworks at each other. So some rich bored kid or you know, some really bored and fucked up entrepreneur bought these really expensive toys and used them to shoot fireworks, like Gatling gun fireworks at each other. So to a certain degree, the Chinese also think like that, but more like a, you know, Chinese New Year joke. Not really like, yeah, Deepseek can help China achieve AGI, and we're going to put all of this AI technology in all of our 6th generation fighters, which, by the way, were 2 or 3 of them were unveiled during Christmas. So obviously, this speaks to a similar mentality on the Chinese public and technology military complex mind. So indeed, this is a very dangerous thought, a very dangerous mentality for the brightest people from both countries when they think about racing to AGI. And the first thing is, we achieve AGI, we achieve absolute military dominance over the other. So indeed, very dangerous. And let's hope this 3 to 5 year timeline doesn't really materialize, or we're going to see a very, very dangerous world very quickly. So that's my shit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I just want to follow up on a round of questions, or follow up with a round of questions. And starting first with you, actually, Feng, we're working backwards. You know, one common recurrent theme I often noted from reading and also browsing through, you know, documents published by the Chinese state on AI is that they also talk a lot about safety, but it's not so much about existential risk and also human AI alignment that they're interested in. It's instead content safety, right? So the Chinese for this is 内容安全, safe content or content safety, 思想安全, you know, ideological safety, and all sorts of emphasis upon ensuring that you don't have violations or transgressions against the baselines of the party, which translate to, of course, in practice, very strictly stipulated inputs in terms of AI models, especially generative models, and also, by and large, for LLMs, the primary concern is producing content that does not comply with certain political baselines. Now, I don't want to get into the sort of mudslinging contest of, you know, which side has more censorship or less. But a question I have for you, Feng, is do you think there's a difference in understanding of safety between A, the business community in Silicon Valley, B, the political community, you know, both of whom are in the States, and then C, the Chinese state and the Chinese government, and fourthly, Chinese entrepreneurs? Is there a difference in terms of safety, a conceptual confusion of sorts that suggests that maybe it's high time that we abandon the concept of safety to draw upon the work of a colleague of mine also on the panel? Or should we instead try and, you know, emphasize that there's a plurality of meanings of safety and that some forms of safety matter more than others? What do you think, Feng?
As a journalist and a part-time teacher of journalism at some Chinese universities, last few years I did research, in particular, Chinese laws and regulations on AI. As many of you know, China doesn't right up until Deepseek, China wasn't really leading the world in developing the most advanced large language models. But China did lead the world in rolling out half a dozen AI laws. Nobody has that many AI laws but China, even today. And of course, many of these laws were dominated by the cyberspace administration of China.
DAP, yeah.
Yes, and also government agencies, law and order side.
Yeah.
So obviously, all of these laws feature a strong national security, ideological security kind of background. But there's another perspective to it. Many people really didn't pay attention to those. So in these Chinese AI laws, they put in written law for the first time in the world, some safety guardrails discussed by people like Jeffrey Hinton and is the Israeli philosopher, historian again.
You mean Yuval Noah Harari?
Yes,
Yeah.
Yuval Harari.
Sapiens.
So the same
Homo deus.
AI safety concerns they were discussing in the last 2 years, for the first time, were put into laws, but nobody else but China. For example, Chinese AI laws were the first to stipulate that internet platform, social media, and short video platforms are required by Chinese laws to label anything that is generated by AI or with AI assistance. The Europeans, some of the Americans were talking about this. Nobody have so far been able to put them into laws. China did with 6 of them, 6 laws like this. But of course, the actual implementation of these laws is another matter. So far, it's been sketchy. I've noticed on many Chinese social media platforms, a lot of content is labeled because on YouTube, TikTok, or anything these days, you can trust anything. You see something that looks weird, looks a little bit out of place, then it's probably AI generated. Nobody is really telling you, but your own kind of experience reading internet shit. So from this perspective, it is heavily politically dominated, very typical communist China, censorship thinking. But they also managed to put something useful, at least from Harari and Jeffrey Hinton's point of view. They were dreaming about these guardrails, and then the Chinese were the first to make them happen, although from a different perspective, from a different motivation. So again, there are different perspectives to seeing this. And many of you may also not realize the Chinese and the Americans and the Europeans have so far held, 5 or 6 rounds of AI safety consultations and discussions among the top scientists. For example, representing the US in Venice and Paris at these AI safety discussions were Stuart Russell, professor UC Berkeley. Representing China was Andrew Yao, professor of Tsinghua, and a few other scientists. But the difference is Andrew Yao and these Tsinghua scientists, they have the ear of the Chinese political elite. They have the ear of the Chinese premier. And who knows, maybe even Xi himself. But Stuart Russell these days, I don't think he could even dream about meeting Trump at any point. So the Chinese, from the top leadership down, obviously paid a lot of attention to AI safety and were eager to hold these discussions with their US and European counterparts. But again, now that with the Trump administration coming up and the remilitarization of Silicon Valley, I'm afraid that these safety talks are going to be dumped by the roadside very soon. China probably still wants to continue them, but I don't see any interest from the US side.
I think both the CAS, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and also the Tsinghua-based center, CISS, I think that's a Center for International Strategic Studies, which was founded by Fu Ying, a former vice foreign minister. Both of them have been quite active in sort of track 1.5 dialogues between China and US on AI safety and alignment. But I want to now turn over to you, Boris, because actually when the Chip and Science Act was introduced in 2022, I was scrolling through Twitter, as I would, a very responsible citizen, and I stumbled upon this comment from a certain very famous writer, Substack leader, who said, totally devastated, crippled, no chance of recovery. This is it. This is the end of the Chinese semiconductor industry. it's over. And the prediction was that, China was unable to recover from the export controls and presumably would fall behind the US and slide gradually but clearly into sort of technological irrelevance and lose the tech race, whatever it is that he was writing about on his Substack. Now, in retrospect, he said this is not what he believed. So I believe this is not what he believed, but maybe others wouldn't. But in any case, my question for you is, to what extent do you think export controls on Chinese technology have in fact been effective from the American perspective in inhibiting China's technological growth? And to what extent have they been ineffective? And what does this, augur or portend in relation to the dynamics going forward as Trump looks eager to apply more export controls as a part of his, very hawkish, well, no, not hawkish, but part of his very selective but clearly antagonistic approach to a tech competition with China. What do you think, Boris?
Well, I think they've been, unnecessary, and in terms of their intended effect, then probably counterproductive. Companies like OpenAI in particular, I think it's just a case study in how to take a nimble, innovative startup and turn it into a bloated, boring giant. And what Deepseek did was to basically expose that to the world. And having export controls on the latest chips just encourage that innovation.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And on that, I want to just open up the floor for one comment before I return to the panelists for their responses. Would anyone like to offer a short and concise comment? Over there? Yes. Thank you very much. Can I bring in Herman or Simon, either one of them, on this, and also your thoughts and discussion thus far?
I think Simon and I have the same thoughts because we've co-authored a little bit on this. So let me say a bit of what I think is. Actually, Dario Amodei has a few things he said about this that I think is kind of sensible. So I don't disagree as much as I do with the other stuff he's saying. And his view is like, if it's really hard to get any collaboration about safety going from those kinds of very general X-risk things, like, it's going to take over and make us into paper clips, because that just seems like a non-real thing. And politicians and people who run corporations and stuff, they're not going to take that seriously. But I do think, like, if we actually get to a point where there is technology that is doing dangerous things, like really dangerous things are happening, and it is a clear and present danger, not just a thought experiment in a philosophy book or in a weird paper. I think that's in a way, the best prospect humanity has for collaboration between the United States and China. Because if there's a thing there that could really destroy very, very many people in very unpredictable ways, that's going to force collaboration. So that not just the thought experiment of existential risk, but an actual risk, which, if we were to believe these people, could then happen within 4 or 5 years. That might force a very different type of relationship here, where we really do sort of try to share values and norms and regulations. And maybe Simon should talk to this. I think Simon's view is maybe at that point we should just ban AI altogether.
Is that possible? Can we ban AI altogether once it gets to that point? I mean, Simon?
Well, I think it's not feasible at this stage, but I would kind of analyze the problem slightly different. So the doomer perspective has two key claims. One is that AI is about to get super powerful. The other is that we won't be able to control it. But, Herman's initial comment was, well, okay, if China agrees to, or the US agrees to the first claim that it will get powerful, and they think that we can control it, that's a recipe for disaster because that creates the race. Because then, well, whoever can get the powerful thing first will be able to control it. So if you accept the first half of doomer part and reject the second half, that's very escalatory for conflict. But if you accept both parts, if you think it's going to get very powerful and we won't control it, that creates opportunity for the US and China to collaborate. So that's one way to kind of analyze the problem.
I like the sounds of this, although I would just flag that there's a striking parallel that perhaps is premature and I shouldn't be drawing here. But if we think about it, there's also another problem that is able to potentially displace millions of people, cause massive suffering, rampant suffering, and potentially render life not worth living in maybe 100 years' time, or actually less than that, maybe 50 years' time. And that is the issue of climate change. And yet Donald J. Trump has just pulled out of the Paris Agreement for the second time. Obviously, he claims this is a huge success for Donald J. Trump, and that's about it. But beyond that, given the current political climate, pun intended, in America, and also the attitudes taken towards sort of issues that are not necessarily the most visible, with effects that are visible in the short to medium term, how confident, hopeful should we be that there is appetite from this leadership in Washington for cooperation over AI with China, especially when it is seen as really a point that it could stick it to the Chinese government with and also potentially win in a strategic rivalry? I want to turn now over to Feng to pick your brains on this. And in the meanwhile, please do keep coming up with questions and comments because I'm going to open up the floor after that. So Feng, what do you think?
Right. I think it depends probably on a couple of milestone events, or at least psychologically significant events or realization. Because right now, in the last 2 to 3 weeks, a big argument between China and the US, at least between the experts and all the internet commentators on the Deepseek phenomenon, is whether this is sufficient evidence that the US chip export control on China has failed. From David Sachs to Dylan Patel to all of the top minds in Silicon Valley, they're trying to say, no, this doesn't say the export control has failed. This actually says we should step it up. We should tough it out. It's working. As long as we keep it up and keep the stranglehold on China for another 3 to 5 years, we achieve AGI, we win. We gotta, keep it going. We gotta make it even harder for China to obtain these high-end chips. So on Chinese side, when I went back to the mainland during the Chinese New Year and talked to some tech industry investors and experts, there seems to be a blind faith in either Huawei or someone else to achieve another surprise breakthrough within a very short period of time. Maybe people have already become used to the idea that Huawei is the magic maker, always makes the impossible happen. Although a lot of other people are still very pessimistic, saying 5 years. Yes, Huawei may pull it off, Huawei or somebody else may pull it off in 5 years, but nothing as quick as within 5 years. So from that, you probably will conclude that, yes, the chip export control will probably keep, and also not China will not be able to obtain serious enough, large quantity, high-end chips to feed any more advanced models like Deepseek in the next few years. So China will still lag behind. So my point is, if China could achieve a kind of a surprise milestone in high-end chip making or bypass the chip export control and achieve the compute power through another way, then this would be very significant to make the US realize, well, maybe at this point, it's all futile. Maybe now we should sit down and talk. As long as the US believe they have the stranglehold and they have this 5-year lead, they will probably never sit down and talk to China on AI safety. That's my point.
you know, a lot of the talk thus far has focused on, you know, the size of the chip, right? That whoever's racing and able to race to 1 nm or, you know, the equivalent, essentially, that's a sign of victory in this race. So it's all about cutting down in size, bolstering efficiency. But then, just to be provocative here, I might argue that, are we looking at an era where Moore's law is no longer the determinative factor of this race, that maybe Moore's law is going to meet its natural conclusion as we race towards this 1 nm limit, beyond which it really makes very little sense to talk about sub nm, you know, chips, so to speak. And therefore the question has to be about packaging, has to be about energy efficiency, has to be about all of these other questions neglected right now in comparisons and juxtapositions when it comes to chip development and also by extension AI development. Going back to what we said just then at the start about efficiency of algorithms and models and whatnot. So maybe that's just a thought that, you know, we should bear in mind. It's not just about the chip size. Size is not all that matters in the context of semiconductors, to be very clear. So on that note, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Who would like to raise a comment and a question? I see Nate, and also I recognize a hand at the back order. So we'll start with Nate. Thank you.
I have a question. I was surprised that people are still talking about the chip controls, but not the AI diffusion rule. It seems to me that the existence of the AI diffusion rule put in place at the very end of the Biden administration, right before, like in January 10 or something like that, is an indication that the US government thinks that the export controls have failed so far to prevent access to chips. So the question is not whether the export controls have failed. Like clearly the US administration, and there's no sign that the Trump administration is like removing the AI diffusion rules. So it's a sign that they also think that the export controls. So the question is whether the diffusion rule will work. It seems like a centrally planned compute economy, which is effectively what's being like proposed by the United States, is probably not a great idea for efficiency, but given the US's like strategic importance to the countries they're going to attempt to dominate with this rule, it seems like it might be effective. So I wonder if what people think about that.
Excellent point from Nate. And very quickly, the gentleman over there. Oh, yes. Hi, Alhom. Yep. Very quickly. You want a mic? Okay.
Question is more centered around the environmental aspects of AI. So as you have mentioned that China has the most AI regulation laws, but when we look at the fact that they made Deepseek open source, it gives way for the free market to do the free market thing, which is prop up random AI bots, as we have seen with OpenAI's ChatGPT-3 model, where if you go on, say, Twitter, or if you go on Instagram, you see ads for these paid AI chatbots, which have functions like talk with Socrates, talk with like this philosopher, talk with Nietzsche, or whatever. Now, the issue with that is these, like when you make these AI bots available to the world, right? 5 prompts on ChatGPT costs around a bottle of water, and roughly 14% of the world does not have access to any water. So how would China deal with addressing this issue, given the fact that they made Deepseek open source and people can exploit it to an even higher degree than they did with ChatGPT?
Thank you very much. Okay, so it's a question about both premium and environmental costs. All right, who would like to take a stab at Nate's question, which is very relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I can say something about it.
Yep.
I'm not sure what role it would have in the light of like open source models being developed now. I mean, sure, we can try to prevent the transfer of technology from the United States to countries that they consider to be the adversaries, but I find it hard to see how this would be effective, given that we all know what the state of the art is.
Just to follow up, so I mean, I take it the US government's position is that the export controls failed because cloud computing exists. And so the diffusion rules are an attempt to say no more cloud computing for certain countries. No more AI-focused cloud computing.
Yeah, that pressure to take sides and also to get countries to recognize that very fact was actually enshrined by what was done by Microsoft Azure to UAE's G42 just last year and the year before in relation to the collaboration with Baidu. I mean, G42 ended up shelving that collaboration partnership because of pressures from US firms. And I think we see a sort of legal bolstering of that, which means that cloud computing could well be the next battlefield. And a question here just on my end, before I open up the floor again and also get someone to answer Ahom's question. The question or the observation I'll make is that when I travel through to, say, Southeast Asia, specifically Malaysia, Indonesia, to some extent Vietnam as well, what I hear from officials and diplomats and also entrepreneurs is that they believe there's a degree of wiggle room and that there's a degree of gray area and also maneuverability when it comes to compliance with chip regulations, but also with the sort of diffusion related policies and ban that the US wants to introduce. Now, it might be them being over optimistic and too hubristic, but I think there's genuinely sort of an increasingly apparent tendency to push back against unilateral demands that may or may not succeed. I'm not saying they will succeed. I'm not saying the sort of wiliness would necessarily go unpunished or unnoticed, but it's just worth noting that I guess this is how third-party countries are trying to resist the pressures to choose sides, whether it be in AI or data or cloud computing or in data in general. They don't want to take sides. I'm going to bring in the audience member over there, and I'm going to invite the panel to sort of follow up on the questions after that. So over to you, Eddie. Yes, hello. Please feel free to use the mic, because otherwise the audience online can't hear your insights, which I'm sure are great.
Yeah, I think in terms of U.S. attempt to stop China or whatever, I mean, chips is, I think, the most obvious one, but yeah, as some people know, may not be working that well, and then diffusion rule is the next. But I think if I were the U.S., I think the problem, especially with respect to Deepseek, because it's a distillation model, that means it trains a lot off of like output of, say, especially GPT-4 or so-called synthetic data. I think clearly, even within the U.S., the problem is, I think now, OpenAI and others will try to prevent other people from learning off of their model, like this web crawling thing. So I think each of them will try to either block these web crawlers, or at least slow them down like tremendously, like limit the API, the speed or number of queries, etc. And then if I were the US, I would build a firewall. Since China has firewall, but it's the other direction. China prevents people from going outside. But if I were the US, I would build a firewall that blocks China attempts to, to not let them crawl in. Because especially the Chinese firewalls basically says normal users who could be potential clients of, Facebook or Google, they cannot come out. So whoever is allowed to come out are basically stealing and, trying to learn and so on. So I think therefore, I think China should rethink about its own firewall, setup as well. But I think this will be a lot more effective than trying to block chips and so on. But yeah, I don't want to give ideas to Washington, although I wrote about it today. But I think it's very low-level thinking to say, oh, yeah, block sales to Singapore or Malaysia or so on.
Fortunately, you wrote it in Chinese. Unless they use very good GPT, they can't translate it into English. No, I'm just kidding. On that note, anyone want to jump in at these excellent questions on the panel? So maybe we'll the premium price question from Ahom and the bottle of water analogy, and also Eddie's point about building a counter firewall.
I can give it a shot, the bottle of water and environmental concerns, and it's just a very depressing reply. I think insofar as people buy into the story that this is going to give us super intelligence that will enable us to rule the universe and have complete control over everything and replace workers, no one's going to care at all, and it's going to be full steam forward, and no one's going to make there's not going to be any environmental concerns whatsoever. That's my prediction for the next 10 years.
Yes. And I guess, Simon, do you want to jump in at that?
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that maybe the other way a bit. I do think people sometimes overestimate. It's very easy to overestimate the energy consumption of AI. And the reason for that, which is related to Brian's questions about Moore's law, is in fact, there are predictable improvements in efficiency over time. So there's an effect called Kumi's law that says every 1.57 years, the energy efficiency of compute doubles. And here's a just shocking number that is, an instance of that. So between 2010 and 2018, global data center compute increased by 5.5x. Okay. Here's how much energy use increased at the data center, 6%. So you have to be careful. Now, look, energy use will be going up because the amount of compute being used is going to be going up way more than 550%. I mean, so for example, Elon is right now scaling up from 200,000 to 1 million of the relevant chips. So, we're getting, and that's just one person, so we are going to have energy increases, but many of the even environmental groups doing these estimates are suggesting US data center energy use may have like a 2 to 3x, so doubling or tripling by 2028, 2030. So it's, there is a limit because there's, a doubling effect on efficiency every 1.5 years or so. It's very easy to get disoriented about the energy cost.
Thank you. And just a quick comment. I want to direct the conversation back to you, Feng, and it's about the Chinese state and the Chinese state's approach to DeepSeek and response to DeepSeek as a whole. I've been reading a lot of these interesting conspiracy theories on X and also a number of other platforms who are basically, speculating over the origins and the nature of DeepSeek. They say, actually, guys, DeepSeek is not a sort of David. It's a Goliath wearing the mask of David. So that meme where you basically take off, there's a veil and it's like a ghost with a veil on a ghost, and you take out the veil and actually it's peekaboo, so it's a different ghost, so to speak. Anyway, beyond explaining memes, what's really going on here is, of course, is a deeply seated mistrust and a perception that DeepSeek is not what it is letting out, or letting on others to think or leading them to think it is, right? And therefore, my question for you is, how do you think the Chinese state is going to react to the successes of the likes of DeepSeek, assuming that it is, in fact, a sort of bottom-up, grassroots entrepreneurial enterprise, right? You saw Premier Li Qiang receiving Liang Wenfeng on January the 20th, which is the same day when the announcement came out, in a 座谈会 in Beijing. So in a seminar, a closed-door seminar in Beijing. And since then, a lot of the open or official press releases from the Chinese state have emphasized, wow, this DeepSeek, it sprouted out of nowhere. It came out of nowhere, right? We're very impressed. This is wonderful. Seems to me that they're trying to characterize this as a grassroots initiative, not as one that the state could lay claim to. Will this compel a rethink then in China's approach to industrial policy? And maybe would this therefore lead to less top-down attempts to drive forward investment and more actual empowerment of grassroots entrepreneurship, and to, really empower the private sector to once again take charge of what they've done best over all these years, which is to spearhead China's innovation and growth? What do you think?
I think DeepSeek alone is probably not enough, even though it shocked the US to such a degree, is not enough to drive a rethink on the Chinese state point of view. As we discussed in the group, a lot of people didn't realize DeepSeek was developed by a quant fund. In 2015, 10 years ago, there was a stock market crash in the Chinese A-share market. And who did the government blame it on? Foreign investors and quant funds. So quant funds were very much like pariah status in China for the last 10 years. They had to lay very, very low and make their money as quietly as possible. And of course, they did manage, DeepSeek, parent company did manage to make a lot of money to fund all of their GPUs. So in itself, this is a lesson for the Chinese government. A lot of the surprise breakthroughs happen where you are not paying attention. But of course, on the other side, the Chinese government has enough success stories in the state-sponsored, heavy-handed, top-down, state-sponsored innovative drive, like the Hefei phenomenon. Hefei as a city has 6 to 7 such state champions, all planned, all state money. And of course, at the end of last year, all of these 6th-generation military fighters, well, those were certainly state-sponsored, state-planned, world-class, surprised everybody. So China, from the Chinese government point of view, they have enough success stories from the state-sponsored model to not make them, change tack overnight. DeepSeek itself, again, its impact is probably somehow exaggerated, overestimated on the US side. In China, it is seen as a surprise national champion, but there are 20 such national champions that emerged in the last year, except nobody else paid attention. What about Unitree? What about Deep Robotics? What about BrainCo? All of these other, state champions that the foreigners didn't read about. So yeah, DeepSeek in itself is probably not enough to switch the whole mindset.
That's very fair. And I'm going to take another round of questions and comments from the floor. So please do feel free to jump in with your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Is that a hand over there? No? Oh, sorry. There's a hand over there. Oh, yes. Hi, Nicholas. Yep. Mm-hmm. Excellent question. Any thoughts from the panel? Who would like to jump in? Maybe Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I agree it doesn't matter for the average user, but I think it matters a lot for the geopolitical questions because the issue is, I mean, first of all, I don't think we know the answer. I don't think anybody's provided like positive evidence for these conspiracy theories. So unclear what's happening. But look, if it turns out that Deepseek actually distilled the model or, in other ways, it cost more than they suggested, then that might suggest that they're not as close to the frontier as it seemed. And even though they can catch up, they're less likely to suddenly come out with a model that's better than US models. And that affects significantly the, potential race dynamics between the US and China because, both the US and China will be estimating how likely is it that we're going to leapfrog the other, with the next model. So that's going to be the big geopolitical question. Doesn't matter for users though.
Mm.
Well, the picture would be, for example, if it turns out that, 2 or 3 generations of frontier models from now, there's a new model that can really help with military applications. It could have significant effects on balance of military power would be one example that's been that's one of the lines that's being pushed, I think, in Washington.
I reckon just to supplement that, one way of looking at it graphically is that, are we still working on the same curve? Are we still moving along the same curve? Or are we instead moving along a different curve that sort of shifted or basically reflects the same curve, but with a very drastically distinct, sorry, not the same curve, but a different curve with a very different and much steeper gradient, right? So the question is, which is the right way of conceptualizing developmental pathways? And is it true, or if it is indeed true that the Chinese have managed to do this at a much lower budget, and imagine if the same amount of resources were thrown at the same exercise or task, what would be the yield of that very enterprise? But I agree with you, Nick, that asking these questions is really, it's sort of like a speculation for the sake of speculation. We're kind of arguing and debating over a lot of very much spurious claims in the open because it's very hard to vindicate or verify any of these claims and counterclaims given the very limited information we have access to and the abundance of information we don't have access to. We know what we don't know, but we don't know what exactly it is that we don't know. But on that, any other questions from the floor? I think this side of the room has been quite quiet lately, so I just want to look towards this road. I recognize a hand over there. Yes. Yep.
Thank you. My question is, one of the big problems with DeepSeek is obviously it's a great model and cost may be very cheap, but it's always kind of unavailable. Server is always busy, maybe too many people using it. That I can think it translates to that they don't have as much compute as the US, obviously, and for them to go further and evolve, is this their key limiting factor? Is that they don't have enough compute? Thank you.
Is that the rate limiting step? Maybe Boris, you want to take a stab at that?
I'm afraid I don't have the expertise to think about like what the resource constraints are in generalizing the model to wider applicability.
I recommend again the Lex Fridman podcast. In that one, they discussed it in detail. Yes, that does say DeepSeek, according to Dylan Patel in that podcast. That does say that the DeepSeek doesn't have the compute power to serve. It has the compute power to train the model, but it doesn't have the compute power to serve large amounts of users on that model. So that is an issue. But the thinking on the Chinese tech community over the last couple of weeks seemed to have switched to, but we are very good in robotics. We have Unitree, we have deep robotics. This could help China in terms of, applying the models in these robotic platforms and achieve actual productivity. That's one way for China to make up for the lost edge in developing these models or servicing these models. They're very quick to put them into, drones and robots and 3D printers to make actual productivity happen.
Okay, we've spoken a lot about the state of yes, Nate. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to ask a different question, but
All right. Well, I can transition to you very shortly, but we've spoken a lot about the current state of affairs and state of play between China and the US. But I just want to throw out two questions for us to think about before I bring in Nate. And the first is that the world is more than just China and the US, and obviously China and the US are leading players in the AI race. But is there agency on the part of other countries and other players beyond these two, or are they all basically rule takers and complete rule followers? In other words, is there room for maneuvering and also for countries to be more dexterous than they'd like to be? Or is this one of the rare situations which do exist in international relations where, basically, unless you belong to one of these two poles in this very bipolar and bifurcated, increasingly bifurcated scenario, unless you are either of these poles, you have to just take it as it is and accept your fate as a rule follower and take it? That's one question. And the second question, so that we don't end on a sobering and very pessimistic note, for the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to invite us all in the room to think about the question of what next, right? So we agree there are lots of risks, lots of calamities, lots of dangers. We agree that both sides are enmeshed in this sort of deeply structural mistrust between the establishments on both ends, especially, now that Trump's in power. Who knows what's going to happen? It's a Russian roulette. But what can we do and what can be done to make the lives of people living on this planet slightly better than in the counterfactual? But on that note, I'm going to turn over to Nate, and I'm going to recognize Abigail behind Nate for further question.
Oh, yep. I mean, my question is very related to the first thing you were asking. So there's been a lot of talk about the strategic competition between the US and China, and with other countries just sort of being out of the picture as satellites or something like that. But I think maybe that's because a lot of the focus here has been on the military, possible potential future, who knows what military applications of these technologies. But I'll just note that one way this could go, and one thing that maybe US policymakers are very likely thinking, is that one way to win is just to get 10% GDP growth for 8 or 20 years, and for your competitor to only get 3% GDP growth. And that's just as bad from the point of view of strategically dominating your opponent as an actual military intervention. In that case, can very easily happen with diffusion controls. And in that case, the choice that the sort of so-called satellite countries are facing is sign up for, well, you maybe don't get 10%, but you get 8% GDP growth. Or sign up for 2% GDP growth. And I think I know what most countries sign up for in that case. And so that's a different way of thinking about the conflict here that doesn't end up being a military conflict. Maybe the military is in the background ensuring that certain things go certain ways, but it's essentially an economic conflict in that case. And I think 10% GDP growth as a result of, capturing the labor share of GDP with capital in the way that we were talking about in the first panel and it's been brought up here is completely within the realm of feasibility in the next 15 years in a way that maybe robots being powered by Deepseek version 20 is not very likely. So yeah, I just wonder.
Thanks, Nate. That's a great point. And just going to bring in Abigail. Yes.
More focus on AI regulations. I think one of the panelists mentioned, China has issued some more comprehensive AI regulations, but I would say across APEC, there's more discussion around, let's say Brussels effect, how EU's regulations are impacting different countries' AI regulations. So I think my question is, with the new administration and with this all escalating geopolitical tensions they're describing, do you think that we'll see more efforts on China's side to try to influence regulations across APEC governments? I would say so far there's not that much discussion. So we'd be curious to see, if you're seeing anything sort of interesting efforts by China's state, but also, the non-state actors and how they're influencing the regulatory landscape across Southeast Asia and APEC in general. Thanks.
Wonderful. So there's a question of the logic of taking sides in the economic war and the race, and then there's a question about APEC regulations. Who would like to take a stab at Nate's question? Herman?
I think it's Nate's question was also your first question
Yeah.
about other countries, so sort of related to all of this. And this goes back to something I said in my introductory remarks. I don't think that creating a super smart, super intelligent LLM is going to make much of a difference to anything. I think it's those things are going to be to some extent available open source at some point to lots and lots of places around the world. And what's going to matter is how you change your society, how you change laws and regulations, how you put it into your civil service, how you make laws that enable the stock market to make use of it in an efficient way, how you specifically put it into details of your military. And those things are going to take very long time because even though we can develop these models pretty quickly, societies change super slowly. I am guessing that 5 years from now, this university will work exactly the way it does right now, even though we don't even really need this university. So, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but but it's going to be very, so these changes, the sort of structural changes are happening very slowly. We have this sort of like genie in a bottle, and we're trying to figure out how to spread it around in our social structures. And those structures can take decades to change. And so I think as a kind of indirect answer to your question, so countries other than China and US will probably do it much better. I'm originally Norwegian. I can imagine Norway, actually I can't, but you can sort of fantasy imagine that Norway would do a very good job like integrating this. And it would be an easier thing to do than to do it in the United States or China.
It's not about getting to the frontier or just about getting to the frontier. It's also about the application, the regulation, and the incorporation of it, of AI, so to speak, into how governance works. And that ties in very neatly with a question about APEC regulation. Who would like to take a stab on APEC? So everywhere ranging from Australia through to South Korea, the Asia-Pacific, Oceanic Basin. Oh, wow. Never said that phrase before. Anyway.
Maybe you could address the question about like whether you think countries of that sort are going to be like you have this like leader or follower framing with rulemaking. It seems like there's a problem for these countries.
Very good.
Yeah.
I actually think, and this is my personal not so hot take, between rule setting and rule following, there's also a third modus operandi, which is rule bending. And that is to say that rule benders are those who are largely willing to comply with rules wherever is demanded and required of them. But where possible, they would do their very best to contest and to push the boundaries of laws to create more wiggle room for themselves. And one of the case in point examples I'm thinking of here is Singapore. You know, Singapore is incredibly good at negotiations on the monetary level in terms of monetary systems and banking systems when it comes to, you know, a conference, say a Basel meetings, for instance. I've been told that Singaporean representatives, you know, from the relevant organs, often very good at saying, we agree with you on X, Y, and Z. We think these are great rules. We're going to follow them. But have you thought of addendum X, Y, and Z, or addendum 1, 2, and 3? And here's where they slot in more addenda that favor, or rather, you know, render the playing field more level for small and medium states and also their interests as well. Now, the question is, can you apply the same model to AI? And I would actually say that, yeah, let's set aside AI for now. When you look at chips, for instance, there are many exemptions that exist in the Chips and Science Act, right? That basically meant that when they were trotted out, there were intentional pores that were left in the regulations, thanks to pressure from a lot of American allies who say, well, I'm sorry, you can't force me to sort of choose between providing chips to China or not. You know, I'm not going to play ball 100%. I'm going to play ball 70%. I'm going to play ball 80%, but you can't ask of me 100% total submission. And that is another case of sort of rule bending when it comes to the hardware and also the chips question, which I agree with you, may no longer be the most salient and germane, but there's still efforts made by governments beyond China and the US to bend the rules, to give themselves more, you know, flexibility, so to speak. Now, the final question is on data and also the usage and access to data. And here's where I'm going to share a personal fear of mine. I fear that in the sphere of data, we're trending towards an increasingly bifurcated world order, where China, of course, has long been very, very keen and also driven to securitizing, right, a vast majority of its own data. And that's why you see a lot of these laws and ordinances passed concerning not leaking national security secrets or national level secrets that could endanger and undermine state security. There's a lot of emphasis upon data control and exclusive data control, so to speak. Now, if America were to take up the recommendation from Eddie concerning a counter firewall, building a firewall to prevent access from outside, or even sort of building on that to privatize data and turn it into commercializable and selectively commercialized entities and quantum, then we could be seeing, a world where data is increasingly siloed and access to it would be contingent upon which camp and which side you're on. But then the critical determinant, I feel, to all of this is not so much countries or governments of APEC countries or APEC governments, APEC states and administrations, is instead corporations. If you look at Jensen Huang with NVIDIA, Jensen very clearly has his own game plan. He's not going to sort of play ball entirely with the American agenda. After all, he did come to Hong Kong and he spent a lovely evening with Paul Chan in a hot pot, in a Cantonese, what is it again, a tartan hang, where he had hot pot with our official. And of course, Jensen received an honorary doctorate from USD. He was in town, and I believe he's personally quite conflicted, but also quite adamant that he is not going to become subservient to the American military-industrial complex. And I would say the same could be said of many leading Chinese, tech giants, of which we have a panelist who spoke in a previous session who would know a lot about, of course, the likes of, say, Tencent and also Alibaba as well. Again, these corporations want to choose. They are gunning for the ability to choose, and I don't think it's as straightforward saying time to pay up and time to take it or leave it. So that's where the complication kicks in my view, to answer your question. Don't just look at governments, also look at corporations and private citizens as well. And now I see a hand from Simon. So over to you, Simon.
Yeah, I did have one other reaction to Nate's excellent comment. So what Nate was emphasizing, which I think a lot of people have kind of brought up in passing, is there's at least two different dimensions to this conflict, AI conflict that's happening. There's a military race, and then there's an economic race. And one thing I wanted to flag is they have different properties in terms of the solutions you can get. So it can be very dangerous to just think of the AI race as like a weapons race, because weapons races, it actually is sometimes fairly easy for two parties to agree to deproliferate, because basically we can get into a situation where, well, the US and China could each build another battleship, but if they both build the battleship, they'll be roughly the same as they were before, and they wasted some money. So that's called the guns versus butter trade-off, because you could have spent the money on butter instead of guns. But the issue with the AI race is, well, hold on, no, it's not just like weapons, because they are butter. And so the economic race, they're the cow. The economic race does not have that property. You can't, no one ever halts an economic race because it's too expensive to, produce more widgets. And so that makes it extra hard for the US and China to agree on some kind of, we're going to have less AI, So that is why it can be dangerous to just think of it as like Sputnik or just like a weapons race.
Great. We're coming up to the end of our session, so I'm going to go through a round of closing remarks for our wonderful panelists today. Before we do that, any last thoughts from audience members? Any comments that you've been dying to put forth? Well, not literally, but you really would. Yes, Professor Albert Chen, please. You have the last word from the audience.
Actually, I have a question which follow up from what you said, what Brian said earlier on. You mentioned the Chinese concern with 内容安全, 思想安全, which can be translated as the safety of the content and safety of the ideology and so on. So my question is that is about the data on which the Chinese AI, such as Deepseek, has been trained, and the data on which, say, ChatGPT or other Western AI have been trained. I suppose one possible difference is the language. Maybe the Chinese AI is more familiar with sources in Chinese. But another problem is the ideology. On politically sensitive issues, is it less reliable to use the Chinese AI if I'm doing research, on matters which may concern this 内容 or 思想 ideology, the baseline which you mentioned, set by the party. So maybe would it be less reliable, less useful to use a Chinese-based AI?
Thank you. Just for context, Professor Chen is one of the leading experts on Chinese constitutional law in China. So it's great that he asked this question, actually. I'm going to see if anyone would like to answer the question on reliability. And alternatively, we can also do a round of closing remarks. So if you could weave that or your answer to Albert's question into your closing remarks, that'd be wonderful. And we can perhaps start in reverse order, keeping the remarks quite short successively, starting with Feng and then concluding with Herman in that order. Just any thoughts on Albert's question and also any final thoughts for the panel as a whole. So over to you, Feng.
In my practice, it is, with Chinese AI, Deepseek has been shown to, you ask it something political, it starts typing and then halfway it deletes everything and says, sorry, I cannot answer this question. It's inappropriate. So yes, on sensitive political questions, Chinese AI probably don't really deliver. But of course, American AI has also been shown and proven to have certain political biases, not in terms of U.S. China, but in terms of left and right, Democrats versus Republicans in the U.S. So I guess from a journalist point of view, when I'm doing research on political issues, I won't trust any AI, basically.
That's a bit bleak, but thank you very much, Boris.
Something nice about the transparency of limitations when you're engaging with DeepSeek. I mean, it just basically will tell you that it won't have a conversation about a certain topic. Whereas the way that censorship in U.S. models is built in is more innocuous. You ask, show me a picture of 10 of the leaders of the largest companies in the U.S. or something, generate an image, and it generates an image of people that are 5 white and 5 black because there's a fairness algorithm that requires outcome parity, right? You're like, well, that's but the way that has been built in is much much more innocuous.
Thank you. Simon, final remarks.
Yeah, so final remark I'd make, throughout the discussion, I think it was clear that there's a lot of uncertainty about whether export controls will work. And just one observation I want to make is at the end of the day, it may matter much less whether they work as whether the US and China agree on the extent to which they work. Because the point is, if they don't agree on whether they work, then there's a very high chance of conflict. And so that's a different way of thinking about it than just speculating about whether they do work.
Interesting. Thank you. And finally, Herman, you have the last word on the panel.
I think I just want to re-emphasize a point I've tried to make a few times. I don't think there's a race about developing some super powerful genie in a bottle. So I don't think there really is a race that's unified. I think that whole way of framing what's happening is incredibly unhealthy. There is going to be developing of some kind of language models plus a bunch of other things, and then some decades of societal changes that will integrate that. And none of that is usefully described as a race.
Wonderful. Now, on that note, I'd like to take this opportunity to say what an incredible discussion. Thank you so very much to my fellow panelists, Professor Herman Cappelen, Professor Simon Goldstein, Professor Boris Babic, and also Wang Feng. Thank you very much for your incredible insights and contributions. Please give them a massive round of applause. Thank you.